So welcome to the Food Waste Challenge. And I am Chris Ketke. I'm the chairman of the Feed Planet Committee. And we have embarked on this program along with our partners of ISIC and Electrolux, and our good friend Holly Elmore at Elemental Impact. And what we wanted to do was to embark on something that would help change behaviors and would have, at the same time, help us run our businesses as chefs. And so what we did is we decided on a focus of food waste. Because the interesting thing about food waste is everybody in every restaurant in every country across the globe has a certain amount of food waste. It's part of running a restaurant. It's part of food service. The problem is that sometimes the amount of food waste that we're producing is large, and every time we throw food away, if you think about it, it's food that we purchased, that we spent our money for, and then which goes as an expense in our business, and effectively we're not able to sell that food and generate revenue. So what happens is we're incurring an expense without generating revenue, and that's kind of a double bad thing. So from the restaurant perspective, from the business perspective, addressing food waste is something that can only be beneficial to our operations. From the sustainability perspective, the problem of food waste, as we're going to see in a minute, is enormous. And just by way of introduction, we at World Chefs introduced a curriculum a number of years ago to talk about food waste, to talk about sustainability, and instruct about sustainability. And what we always say is that every part of sustainability is interconnected, and everything has an impact on something else. And that's very true when it comes to food waste, because one of the things that people don't talk a lot about is what I always say is my banana peel example. And that is that, you eat a banana, you take the banana peel, and you throw it in the garbage, in the rubbish. And that then, in many instances, most instances in the world, will then be taken to a large hole in the ground and thrown in the hole in the ground, and then covered with additional garbage, and that one day it's covered over with a bunch of dirt. And most people believe, as I used to, that, well, banana peel will biodegrade over time, and like it would in most instances be eaten by bacteria and worms, and be turned into some very nice helpful product for fertilizer, essentially for the soil. And that is unfortunately not what happened. What happens when you take that banana peel and it goes into a hole in the ground is that as it's covered with more and more stuff, the problem is there's one critical ingredient that's missing, and that ingredient is oxygen. When we talk about composting, it's a very different process. That banana peel is put into dirt and with other biodegradable materials, and it's mixed periodically. And in other words, we're introducing oxygen into the equation, and what that happens is that there's a certain set of bacteria that break down the banana peel into exactly very healthy soil fertilizer. When it's in a big hole in the ground without oxygen, what happens is a different set of bacteria, anaerobic bacteria, eat the banana peel. And what happens over time, it's a slow process, is that methane is generated, and the methane then escapes through the ground, goes into the atmosphere, and is far more damaging to the ozone layer than carbon dioxide. In other words, it contributes much more intensely to global warming. So that little banana peel actually has a direct role in global warming and the degradation of the world environment. And that's where we say food waste is of absolute importance, how much we produce and where it goes. So that's a very long introduction to the first slide. And so what we're going to talk about today is exactly this. This is the beginning part of the Food Waste Challenge, and I'm thrilled that you are going to be taking part in it. Step number one is to learn a little bit about the global challenge in food waste, which I've started to talk about already. Then I introduced the food waste challenge. And then we're going to talk about creating the baseline measurement, which is the first step in the food waste challenge. And we'll finish up with some Q&A. So going on to the next slide. So I just talked a little bit about why we're doing this. And if we look at this from a global perspective, you can see from this slide that the amount of food waste is absolutely enormous. In other words, if we think about the fact that of all the food that is produced in the earth, on the planet, a third of it is never consumed. A third of it, and some reports even put that number higher, and somewhere around 40%. The point is that at least a third of the food that's generated on the planet is never actually consumed. It's wasted somewhere along the way. It could be in the field, it could be in transportation, it could be in our kitchens, it could be in homes, etc. But of course, we in the food service environment have a very special responsibility because of the amount of food that we produce, and thus the amount of waste that we can generate. And if you think about the fact that a third plus of the world's food production is actually wasted, and then you look to the right side of this slide, the green portion, and you look at the fact that 1 in every 9 people on the earth goes to bed hungry every night, and the statistics are even scarier when it comes to young people. It's truly a travesty that of all the food that we produce, so much is wasted, and yet we have severe hunger issues. And as the population of the world grows, that is only going to be a larger and larger problem. Now, of course, the one thing that is always puzzling to me and many others is if we were more efficient with our food, we would be able to really feed everybody on the planet. But waste is a huge problem. So moving on to the next slide, the food waste challenge. This is what we have developed at Worldchefs. And it's the food waste challenge is a way for operators, for restaurateurs, to address the food waste within their own establishments. And it's a technique that we're going to do together. It's a 9-month process for the first step, and I'll get into that in a little bit. And we hope that it then becomes a KPI in your kitchen operations, because reducing waste is simply good business. So the way that this comes together, what we want to do first of all is have the people within the kitchens understand where the food waste comes from and how much we're actually producing. If you talk to most restaurateurs and you say, well, what is the level of food waste that you generate? Most restaurateurs, most chefs would kind of scratch their heads and say, well, I don't exactly know how much food waste, but I think we're doing a pretty good job. But of course, anything that's not measured, well, then we simply don't really know. And what we are just doing is generating an opinion about how our operations function. Working from the standpoint of data is always a better management technique. So the first thing is to understand in each of our operations, how much food waste are we actually producing and where's it coming from? And then part 2 of the food waste challenge is once we understand that, then we start to attack it and say, okay, now that I know where it's coming from and how much I have, how do I reduce it? And by what percentage could I expect to reduce it? So those are the 2 basic steps. And what we're going to be doing today is really addressing the first step, which is understanding the amount of food waste and where it comes from. So breaking down the food waste challenge on the next slide, which is entitled Introduction to Food Waste Challenge, and you'll see there's a number of text boxes there. On the left-hand side, the general sort of macro picture of what we see the food waste challenge being is starting with, well, it says 3 primary stages. The first stage is back of the house food waste, and that's what we're talking about today, and I'll define that for you in just a moment. Then the second phase of this, which would happen in the future, is the front of the house food waste. And then very lastly, and this is much further in the future, is understanding once we sort of tackle the back of the house and front of the house food waste, is to maybe, understanding where the rest of that food waste is actually going in your locale. But that's for down the road. What we're focusing on today is simply back of the house food waste. Now, if you notice the text box in the bottom left-hand corner, the one that's outlined in blue, what is back of the house food waste? And the way that we define it is rather simple. It's any food waste coming from the kitchen at all, in any way, shape, or form. It could be trimmings, meat trimmings. It could be the ends of carrots, the peels of onions. It could be food that has spoiled. Food that, and I mean, I've been in this restaurant business a long time. I know how it works. You go into your walk-in cooler and you discover that, oh, wow, I totally forgot. And this has been in here for, 5 days longer than it should have been, and it's no longer any good, and I have to throw it out. That would be part of food waste. It might be overproduction. At the end of a service, you've cooked off a certain number of things maybe in advance, and you didn't sell them. And there's really not much you can do with them. Now, obviously, if you can serve that to, maybe employees, or it becomes their meal, that's not food waste. But food waste is anything that will actually be thrown into the rubbish bin. It could also be mistakes, which is, during service, I cook a chicken breast and it gets overcooked. I forgot it in the oven or whatever. That would be food waste at that point. It is also leftover unusable products from buffets or events. Now, this is not what's coming back on people's plates. That's for another day. But it's at the end of a buffet, you have a certain number of food products, some of which maybe are usable, some maybe the staff eats. But then there's many times on a buffet, at the end of the buffet, a number of things that are just simply thrown away. That is also considered back of the house food waste. Or maybe it's an off-premise event that you're doing, and you take a number of a certain amount of food, and at the end of the event, you have a bunch of the food left over that's not servable, it's not usable. That is also considered back of the house food waste. So that's how we categorize it. We kick it off today on the 7th of January, and for those who are joining us after this, who are listening to the recording, they would still sort of, everybody will stick with the basic schedule here of 7th of February, March, and April. And so what we're going to do, and I'll be talking about this in a minute, is showing you the strategies and the resources that we have so that you can measure the back of house waste. So what we're doing during this first 3-month period is essentially what you're doing is you're measuring the amount of food waste that you're producing in your restaurant. And thus, over the 3-month period, we'll have a baseline understanding of how much food waste on average you produce on a weekly basis. Now, the reason we do it over 3 months is because every restaurant sort of has an ebb and flow in their business, and we want to sort of capture that average. And so we do need to do this over a number of months. What we ask of you is that on the 7th of February, March, and April is that you send the Excel spreadsheet, which I'll be explaining in a minute, to Lynn, so we can sort of see how you're doing on your progress. And at the same time, if at any point along the way you're stuck, you're confused, something isn't going right, you're not sure about something, please send an email to Lynn, because we're here to support you at every juncture. After that, in the middle of April, we're going to reconvene with another webinar, and that's when we start step 2 of the back of the house food waste challenge. And that's when we actually say, okay, we now have an understanding of how much food waste we all produce on a weekly basis. What is the percentage that each restaurant would like to commit to reduce their food waste? Now, at this point, what is that percentage number? We're not going to worry about that, because what we'll do later is have a whole separate set of tools for you that will help you actually address how to reduce food waste and what a reasonable percentage looks like, because we want everybody to be successful. And so at that point, we will sort of move into step 2, which is actually reducing the food waste. And we'll do that over the next 6 months. So I'm not going to get into that too much, but we will have along the way some additional webinars and sort of, you know, some educational things that we'll have as resources to you. But for today, what we really want to focus on is the baseline measurement. So I've moved on to the next slide, which is called baseline measurement. And what we're going to be giving you, and you should have actually received it, is an Excel spreadsheet, which will allow you to track the food waste in your establishment. And when it comes to the strategies of how do you actually do this, there's 3 recommendations that we have. And the reason we put out 3 is that everybody then can sort of select what makes the most sense in their particular establishment. So let me just go through these briefly. The first is, you know, that if, especially in a smaller operation, you might just have a rubbish bin, a garbage bin in the kitchen for food waste, and everybody just puts their food waste in there during the course of the day. Now, the advantage of that is it's relatively simple. The disadvantage is not everybody has a scale that can measure something that potentially is that heavy, or you have to be emptying it regularly. But that's one strategy to do it. Again, probably a little better for smaller operations. The next one is that you give each of your employees or each small group of employees their own little food waste bin, and that could be anything. It could be you know, any type of container. And what they then do is that they produce during the day certain amounts of food waste, and then you assign one of your employees to every whatever couple of hours just go around and collect those and weigh them and record them. Now, one of the advantages of this is that you have one person who's doing all the weighing, so they sort of understand. You know, you're not going to get inconsistencies. You'll have that level of consistency because one person is doing it. It also allows you to sort of start to understand who and at what time of the day is producing, you know, maybe the larger amounts of waste. And maybe that's normal or maybe it's not. The third suggestion is that same sort of in number 2, everybody gets their own little container, or every small group of employees gets a small container, and they are responsible for weighing it as it sort of fills up. So they would weigh it and then dispose of it. And along the way, they would track their results. Now, the advantage of that is that each employee then is really starting to understand how much food waste that they are actually producing on a daily basis. The downside of that is that you might have inconsistencies of reporting because everybody is sort of weighing it and maybe there are mistakes along the way. What is actually very interesting is that the minute that people know that what they're doing is being recorded, you might already start to see drops in the amount of food waste that people are producing simply because they know that somebody's watching. So you might actually have some positive results even before we actually get going on this sort of formal reduction part of the food waste challenge. So what I'd like to do before I move to Q&A is I just would like to bring up one of the spreadsheets here. So this is the Excel spreadsheet that we'll be giving to you. And is designed for you to use. Again, this is we tried to make this as simple and painless as possible because we know that every chef is busy and every food service establishment is busy. So we want to be able to have you do this and to be able to reduce food waste and frankly become more profitable, but not at making it very onerous. So the way that we have done this is, you'll notice on this first sheet, it's the summary of the 3 months of tracking, okay? And we've, put this in, you would fill out the stuff at the top, what is the measurement unit, who's the chef, manager, etc. And you'll notice that we've divided it up into 3 shifts. Now, 3 shifts may be right or may not be right, depending on the operation, so feel free to change that as needed. And then what we do is if you click the tab at the bottom and you go over to months, this is a summary of each of the months. And then what you do to actually start filling it out is you go over to the weekly piece over here. And so what you would do here is you would assign whoever is, on, shift 1 could be whatever you define that as, 8 in the morning to 3 in the afternoon or whatever it may be. And then you have different areas within your kitchen, and we've just put them as stations A, B, C, D. Feel free to change those to be, garde manger, fish, pastry, whatever, however your particular kitchen is organized. Or it could even just be by the person's name, if you have sort of steady employees, etc. And then obviously, if you have more than 4 stations, you can add as many stations as you wish there. If you have problems doing that with the Excel spreadsheet, please let us know, and we can design that for you relatively quickly. But basically what we do in here is you just would start to put in here, okay, so the amount of food waste on day 1 from station A at shift 1 was 66 kilos, okay? On day 2 it was 25 kilos. On day 3 it was a bad day. It was 102 kilos of food waste. I don't know what these folks are doing, but that's they're not being very careful, or it's a very big operation or something of the sort. What that does then is you can see immediately it produces the totals over to the right-hand side. And then if you go back to the months, you'll start to notice that that's all aggregated onto this. And then of course, if you go over to the summary, that's aggregated over here. So you'll see it in month 1, what that looks like. So the point of using this, it's all interconnected. It's again, ready for you to use. The point here is that the only things that you change on here are on these month 1 weekly, month 2 weekly, and month 3 weekly. These are the only things that you change. You don't change the totals, etc. You just change, like I did, these, the days and the stations that align with it. And if you do that, again, trying to make this as painless as possible, at that point, you will start to have a track record for how much waste you're actually making. And we've done this before with other places, and I think what's fun about it is that once people start to see how much waste they're actually producing, chefs are problem solvers, and we will immediately go, wow, you know what, we see this is where maybe I can reduce food waste. But once you understand it, it makes it so much easier. And that's really the point of the food waste challenge. So for today, what we'd like to ask you to do is, as soon as possible, to start actually implementing this with your employees, and maybe even to have a brief discussion with them so they understand what you're doing and why you're doing it. Because we want to have them be part of the process, obviously, and we want them to be educated. So it's not a bad idea to maybe have a sit down 15-minute meeting with them and just let them know what we're doing, and most importantly why, and that this is part of a larger World Chefs initiative to address food waste and to look at sustainability. And I think the last thing I'll say, and then I'd be happy to answer your questions, is we at World Chefs represent 105 countries, I believe it is. And if you think about the number of chefs and the number of restaurants and the amount of food that we produce and the amount of food that we waste globally, we know that the more restaurants we can get involved in this food waste challenge, the greater impact we will have. And truthfully, if a lot of restaurants start to adopt this and do this, we can have a significant impact on the amount of food waste that's generated globally. And I think that's really exciting. And I want to thank you for being part of that, because every restaurant that contributes is one step further to reducing food waste globally.